Welcome to the Genre Hustle, your virtual sci-fi fantasy writing group. I'm Anton.
I'm Chris.
I'm Lucy.
I'm Carter.
And I'm AP.
And today we are talking about writing tics. AP, what is a writing tic? What are we talking about?
Writing tics, writing gripes, things we hate to see when we're reading something or when we're critiquing our own writing.
Right, things we've seen in our own writing group.
Yep. So this is, we're your virtual writing group, and these are things that we call each other out on all the time. Lucy gave it a good word, which was potholes. And today we're going to discuss craft potholes and story potholes. Craft having to do with more with technique, the craft, whereas story is story.
Lucy, why don't you kick us off? Tell us what your writing tic is today.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about showing versus telling, which is a problem that just seems to keep giving to me. I thought that I understood it. I thought I had a good grasp on it. And then I got notes back from a mentor the other day, and it was just covered in red of places that I was telling the story. So take this sentence, for example. Alice was impatient for the class to be over. You think that you're telling the story. But really what you're doing there is you are telling the story. You're literally feeding the story to the reader. And what it does is it doesn't let them engage in the narrative, essentially. It doesn't let the reader play detective. So instead of saying Alice was impatient for the class to be over, you should really start employing one of 20 million various writing techniques to kind of get the point across without saying it outright. Just kind of like a game. You can use internal dialogue. You can kind of describe the things around her. She could be staring at the clock, obsessing over the clock. And the reader will be like, oh, she's super impatient. It kind of allows them to sort of do the detective work. Or you could use dialogue. You could have her say something to a friend or a teacher. You could use her senses to describe something. What is she doing? Is she tapping her fingers on the desk, or is she ripping little bits of paper up, with her hands? And that would show us that she's impatient rather than telling us. But one of the best pieces of advice I got the other day was a really good way to find where you're doing it is to look for places that you use was and had in your writing. So if you find that you've said Karen was telling her daughter to go home, then that's kind of like a passive way of telling the reader something, rather than saying Karen told her daughter to go home, and then go one step further and look for an active verb that might be more interesting than that. Karen begged her daughter to go home. So you get rid of the was, you get rid of the passive, and you find an active verb, and then your story.
Or you could even replace it with dialogue there, like you were saying. If she's telling her daughter to go home, you can just have her actually saying it.
Exactly. Anything that engages the reader more than just Karen was telling her daughter to go home.
Right. So the reader's like actively experiencing what's happening instead of just being told that something happened.
Yeah. It's like you make them a part of the story as well, rather than feeding them information.
We talk about that a lot, is engaging the reader and keeping them engaged and keeping them turning the pages and wanting to see what happens.
It's kind of massive. Yeah. It is like when you start figuring it out, you're like, oh yeah, it's kind of everything.
And these types of like this particular type of advice, this piece of advice here is something you hear all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you can hear it 100 times. And you still make the mistake over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
It bears repeating over and over again until you've just beaten it into your head and you just do it automatically.
It is the biggest lesson in writing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I got a shock when I went through my chapter and found 1,000 wases and huds and boring.
So for your
sentences.
example, how would you fix it? If you're saying Alice was impatient to get out of class, or I forgot what the actual sentence was, but...
you could use internal dialogue. A sentence that I came up with was, it seemed to Alice as if time stood still. The entire world narrowed to the ticking clock on the classroom wall. Surely it was broken. So when she starts obsessing about a broken clock, you're like, oh, she's impatient. The reader gets to figure it out themselves.
Obviously, your mentor did something good, because that's definitely much better.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I knew what she was talking about.
So I have a couple of craft tics that really bother me. So the first one is very basic, description blocks. Mm-hmm. So what I'm talking about is like You meet the character for the first time. Joe walks into the room. He had brown hair, brown eyes. He was 6'4", 217 pounds.
He was wearing a green polo.
He wore a green
right.
polo on Tuesdays, and on Wednesdays,
His shoes were white.
yeah. So, but it's both a visual thing and like it's actually like you look at it on the page and you can find them like really easily. You want to put those descriptions into the action, kind of like what you were saying about like engaging the reader. So you have, instead of Joe had brown hair and brown eyes or whatever, you say Joe walked into the room. Hey, he said. He ran a hand through his brown hair. What's going on today? Et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah,
Right?
I think that's like a big thing for people who write epic fantasy to keep in mind.
Oh, God, yeah.
Definitely, because when you're describing stuff that is not of this world, you know, you're tempted to put in really elaborate descriptions, and you probably know
Totally.
like in what country the armor was made and the exact like, you know, dimensions of this guy's torso. And
Exactly.
stuff.
And you wanna
And
share
I would say,
Yeah.
especially for epic fantasy, this applies not just to descriptions of characters, but of descriptions of meals and food.
Food is a big deal.
We don't need to know what type of bird laid the egg.
Yeah.
It's almost like you want to hide them almost. It's,
Yes.
within an action already.
That's exactly the best. That's a great
He
way
had
to put it.
headphones hanging around his skinny neck
Exactly.
type thing.
Exactly.
Oh, okay. You get it.
What purpose is it serving of the story?
Exactly. And so that kind of piggybacks into my next sort of pet peeve, which is sentence rhythm. So, and this is something we don't really talk about a lot in our writers group and stuff. And I think it's something that in genre fiction doesn't really get paid attention to as much as in literary fiction. But I notice a lot of times writers learning the craft will have a very static rhythm. So all the sentences will be the same length. The paragraph blocks will be the same. Joe got up and went to the store. Joe decided to buy some milk. He went to the counter with the milk. Okay, so like instead of that, you want to say, Joe wanted milk. He went to the cooler. He pulled out a bottle dripping with a little bit of perspiration from the...
Right, you want to mix it up a little bit.
Exactly. It tires out the reader to read those things too. And it's something I notice a lot in my own writing. I have to go back and break that shit up.
Put those little short sentences and
and they say
quick
for
kind of
act-
easy things. Yeah.
They say for action, it's good to have like short, punchy sentences because that accentuates the rhythm of the action. But then when you're not in, say like in epic fantasy, if you have a combat scene or something, you don't want to have choppy, quick sentences like that.
Yeah, but even like when you're just doing action and it's a lot of short sentences, you don't want them to all have the exact same structure. Like you don't want, he drew his sword, he swung at the dragon blew flames at him, he jumped out of the way. Like,
yeah, you have to vary it.
yeah, and I think it always helps to kind of like make sure that you're in a certain headspace when you're like writing, because a lot of times I get into like a place where I feel like I know what the story is and I'm doing too much work to tell it, and I'm just kind of writing what really amounts to notes instead of doing good prose.
Totally.
And I think like keeping the rhythm in mind, saying stuff out loud when you write helps.
I was
That's
just
a
going to
big- that's a
say,
big one.
read it out loud.
I was going to ask how you avoid that. I guess
Yeah.
you just...
You have to hear it,
You
and that's
have
why
to
it's
hear
great
it,
when you bring
yeah.
it to the critique group. Everyone will come back and say, "This, I can't believe how much this went on. This scene went on." And it's always down, or not always, but it's a lot of times down to sentence structure.
Exactly.
And if you're out there and you don't have a writing group, reading it aloud to yourself or to a friend,
Anything.
is
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Or
record it and
audiobooks
listen
as
back,
well.
Yeah, or imagining like David Attenborough reading it. Or
yeah. Or if you can get David
Could only
Attenborough
wish.
to read it, that's even
call
better.
it David.
happen to be
He's always
friends.
happy to
available.
lend a hand.
So my big one is filtering, and this is one that I bring up all the time. And,
sure do.
And I'm actually gonna read a quick. This is my favorite writing book. It's called Writing Fiction by Janet Burroway, and the sentence goes: when you step back and ask the reader to observe the observer, to look at rather than through the character, you start to tell, not show, and rip us briefly from the scene. So this is when your character. The sentence goes something like, he stood and looked outside the window, and there by the fire hydrant was the white car. When you can just say, the white car was by the fire hydrant. We know the POV, we know whose POV we're in, we know what's going on. You don't need to tell us he looked, he saw, she thought, she was. It's a subtle thing, but it's again takes us out of the rhythm of the reading, and it makes the reader work harder for stuff.
It's almost like putting little blocks in the way
Exactly.
of what
It's
is
like putting a
actually
filter
happening.
on it.
Yeah.
It's like you're putting a filter. Wow, that's where it. Oh my god, I never.
But
figured that out.
it distances you,
It's a
you from the
distancing thing,
text,
exactly.
and it also like makes things take forever.
Yeah.
You know, just to describe certain things. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
And in close narration, it's just unnecessary. Like, you should establish for the reader who's experiencing the plot, whether it's in third person or first person, and you don't have to tell them, like, oh, the protagonist looked, and the protagonist did this, and the protagonist did that. You can just kind of...
But it can be even more.
it happen.
It can be even more subtle. It's like Lucy was saying, she had, she was, she is. It's all these little things that if it's every sentence, it's a little pause that the reader stops,
Right.
Yeah.
has to stop and think about what's going on.
And an opportunity lost to use more interesting words that make your story unique, that detail
Exactly.
your story. But it does, I mean, you have to be careful. You do have to make sure that the reader knows at the start of the chapter, the start of their POV section, that it's them thinking, and then you can kind of, you don't need it all the time.
It's true. It's very easy to fall into that sort of trap too, of just like, especially in first drafts.
Yeah.
You're just getting it on the page.
Yeah, but you gotta go through and get that shit out of there.
Yeah. And again, like you're writing it and then you turn it in and everyone will come back and say, you're doing this thing. Or at least I will. Everyone will come
Anton will definitely say that.
Anton's-
Yeah, it's definitely like, maybe to clarify, like, a lot of this stuff is kind of editing notes, it's not
Yeah.
something that you can necessarily obsess over each one of these things as you're doing a first draft, because a lot of the time just getting the story out there
Yeah,
is
you want to just get the words out.
That's
yeah.
a good point.
Like, that's your whole
Yeah.
thing, Chris, is to, like, sometimes you just have to finish the story. And
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't think, that's bears saying, though, that, like, these aren't things to think about when you're writing a first draft. These are things to think about when you're editing and cleaning up your story, making it better.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, vomit that shit onto the page.
As we're all working towards becoming authors of whatever magnitude we imagine, sure, saying that
World
these
fame.
are things that you can work out in the editing phase is fine, but eventually you want to get to a point where, as you're writing, because this has been hammered into you so much, you do them less, or maybe
Yeah,
not at
that's
all.
all you can. You just want to do them less.
That's the
Yeah.
point.
That's a
That's the
good
point
goal.
of craft is you want to be able to get better at this
Yes.
stuff, so
Right,
that you're
right.
so that you are showing and you're not telling and you're not filtering and you're not putting in huge description or exposition blocks. Yeah,
right, and then you don't have to edit as much.
That's right. And then you just turn in the first draft.
So on that note, a tick that I have that I am super guilty of in all of my, like, shitty first drafts is this thing that happens in fantasy writing a lot that I'm calling it multiple epitaphs, like where you use these elaborate multiple different names for a character in attempt to do like subtle world building or something when you have a character.
You think you're being clever?
Yeah, like say you have like a paladin named Zord, and you're like, Zord walked into the room, then something else happened. The paladin turned, like the paladin's breastplate, blah blah blah. The holy warrior, etc. And
The
it's just
broad
like,
man.
yeah, and like you right around the point. I see like fantasy writers, including myself, do this like all the time. I even really was bad at it in this one draft I did a couple years ago, where I had the epitaphs be like the names of the chapter. So like the name of the chapter would be like the ambassador, and then I would use that as the character's name.
At least you're consistent.
Yeah, I guess. But I think it's important to not do that. It's kind of a form of filtering, and it definitely takes the reader out a little bit. And it's also just dorky. It's
You think you're being clever by saying, "Oh, I'm going to put a little exposition by renaming this guy the paladin
yeah.
or
Yeah.
the spellcaster."
When you read that out loud, that sounds really clumsy.
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
people do that, and,
Makes
and
you
I
sound
think
like
we
a
were
doofus.
all guilty of doing that.
Oh, for sure.
you know,
I can
at
think
times.
of quite a few examples in my own
And
writing.
it's fine to have another character call the person by their, that might be a way to
By
slip
their
it
title,
to
yeah.
slip it
Right.
in. Yeah.
Yeah, dialogue you can get away as long as it's something that a character would reasonably say.
Right. Or
know.
and in dialogue, if someone is referring to this person as, "Oh, well, you mean the paladin, of course," then it's a little bit more natural. It's not necessarily.
So what are we saying? Just pick one name and stick to it, right?
Yeah, I think, just stick to the convention. Like, use pronouns.
Yeah.
Like, use the character's first or full name the first time you introduce them in a section, and then use pronouns the rest of the time, unless you have antecedent issues and then you got to do what you got to do. But definitely don't change the title of the character a bunch of times and call them that.
Good.
Carter.
No, I do the same thing. I have a librarian in my new book, and I can't help changing it up between her name and the librarian. It's just really tempting.
So another tick that I have, and this will kind of transition us out of the technical craft type of pet peeves into more storytelling type of stuff, I think, is cliched characters. And that's something, I mean, it's easy to say don't write cliched characters, but like when you're writing genre fiction,
It's like don't show and tell, like show, don't tell, right? Yeah.
Useless advice. But like, to be more specific, I think that there's like a lot of ways to avoid it, and it's also like a pothole that's very easy to fall into in genre fiction because there's so many conventions, and you want the reader to kind of be comfortable that they're getting what they bought the book for, but you also want to be original. You don't want to just be regurgitating Tolkien.
They're cliches for a reason.
Yeah, so one that like really gets me is like when you have like the cool detached rogue character, or like he's a pirate and he's like nobody really knows his background and he's always squinting and like that's like in every story there's one of those characters. And I think that it's something that it's a trope that you can subvert in cool ways and original ways, but that's like one, every time I see it I'm just like, oh god.
No, I was going to ask you about trope versus cliche.
Yeah, I think that tropes are something that genre writers should be aware of when you use them. It's not bad to use them, and you can kind of subvert them or just play it out straight. Or, I mean, like, it's totally okay to write a cliched character if that's something that you're going for. But I think that it's definitely important to avoid that if you're trying to do original storytelling, for sure.
I think the key word is subvert. So, we're at a stage where genre fiction has blossomed into a big thing. Like it's been around. Like science fiction and fantasy writing is no longer in its infancy. It's an established, important part of the literary canon. And so there are these tropes that become cliches, and the way to deal with those as a modern sci-fi fantasy writer is to subvert them. Instead of having Han Solo save the princess, have the princess save Han Solo or something like that.
So you still have a princess, you still have a rogue.
Well, you can. That's one way to deal with those tropes.
The way that it plays out is different.
Right.
Yeah,
That's true. Yeah.
I think it's just important to be aware of it, Like if
Yeah,
don't write something that's been written before and be under the impression that you're the first person to do it.
exactly.
Right. And if you are going to do it, then be very aware of it so that when somebody calls you on it, you can say, oh, well, what if they did this? Or what if they didn't have this attribute? Or what if the pirate didn't have a parrot on his shoulder?
Yeah, and that's
didn't
like,
have a peg leg.
That's like your whole thing. You have like a dragon, but it has feelings, and you have like a vampire, but he really just wants to be this guy's friend.
Yeah, that's exactly. Like there's been a million vampires in books, but like wouldn't it be funny if he didn't, really like doing vampire stuff?
Well, I think it has to do with the trappings, that one. Character archetypes exist for a reason. You have an inquisitor with a dark past, and that works because it works.
Right.
But it's all about the trappings. You need to put your own spin on things. You need to add your own.
Yeah.
And I think it's
details,
okay for you to have like the Inquisitor with a dark past, especially at the beginning of your book, and then as the book continues, you discover more about that character.
Yeah,
So
he
it's
can't
this,
have the
but
same problems,
this.
the same dark past as Joe Abercrombie writes. You have to come up with your own stuff.
You don't want to use that stuff as a crutch. So you don't want to be like, he's an inquisitor with a dark past, and that's enough. We'll all just go
Right,
along
we'll
with
just
that
go
because
along-
we know the
exactly.
trope.
Right.
Right. You got to bring some special details to that, make it your own, and make it interesting and exciting. But
Yeah.
that's just good writing.
Yeah. Well, it's good character development too.
Right.
Like you want to have, not every character needs to be complex, but you want to have characters that are not super flat or super stereotyped or characters that could be pulled from any other story.
They have to be rounded, so it's a question of how you do that. You know?
And once you master showing versus telling, you find that every sentence is an opportunity for you to make your characters
circle.
Writing
more
is rewriting.
unique. Then you cry.
And then you cry. That always ends in tears.
Yeah.
Wasn't writing always tears?
That's
The point of writing is to cry.
Why do you think I'm drinking?
To play off of yours a little bit, I have another story pothole or a writing gripe that I was and may still be guilty of, and we'll call it the male gaze. When I first joined the group and started submitting chapters, my way of describing female characters was clearly through my eyes, and I've grown up being a man using man eyes. So
dare you.
if the chapter's in
good.
so if the chapter's in the point of view of a woman, I need to think about, or I had to think about, what that was like. She doesn't see herself in the same way that I see a woman.
Can you give us an example of
Can
that?
you give us an example from the beta read? 'Cause that was
to,
the best.
to put myself on the chopping block a little bit. So I have Captain Ardana in my book, and she, woke up. She was woken up in the early morning by a messenger, and she was naked, and she was described as a blade, but also, very feminine, and just ways that a woman wouldn't necessarily look at herself at. I'm not saying that all women.
Oh, she was thinking about her boobs.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
the people
Yeah.
in the critique came. and
No,
they
is
said-
that wrong?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that was it. They said.
Yeah.
You don't just like wake up in the morning
And
and think
think
about
of your
admire
boobs.
your own breasts.
Women only think about their boobs when men are staring at them in the park in a creepy way, and then we're like, "Hey, stop staring at my boobs."
To be fair, that's what the men are thinking about. So
It's true. Yeah.
No, to your credit, AP. So you took that note and you fixed it. You
Yeah.
learned,
Yeah.
as we all
He's
need
learning.
to do. We're all guilty of doing things like that. I wrote a whole draft of a novel, and I realized I had written essentially a Save the Princess cliched story where, the guy goes to rescue his girlfriend, and I had to fix it because I was like,
because you got called out on it.
I got called on it, and I also was embarrassed that it had come out of me.
Yeah.
And this is part of our job as writers is to confront this stuff in ourselves.
Well, and it's part of the
fix
group
it.
too.
Yeah.
That was I think it was a huge lesson when you brought that to critique, and everyone said,
Absolutely.
"Look, she's not. Women don't get up and look, and look in the mirror and think about their boobs." And you went, "Oh, that's a great point."
Yeah. And actually, I think that goes to, beyond the, societal issues that come with the male gaze, I think it's also a point of view problem. It's me not being in the right point of view.
Yeah, that's a good point. You want to be, especially because it's like, I feel like large majority of fantasy writing is in that kind of third person limited perspective. And it's really important to know who is narrating the chapter. And when you're writing a story with multiple POV characters, it can be confusing and it's harder than it sounds. And I've had that problem before too, where I'll write two characters and realize that really this is all just me narrating and I'm not really getting into these characters' heads.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's daunting. I would have the exact same problem if I was trying to write a male soldier. I'd be like, I have no idea. what
Voice
this-
is
It's
tough.
not
Yeah,
that
it's-
complicated.
But at the end of the
Or,
day,
you say that, yeah,
at
but
the end of the day, there's
No,
not
I'm
a
kidding, I'm
massive
kidding.
difference between the way
No, but these
that
subtle...
you write the characters. It's more about their motivations and what's driving them than it is.
and that's
a
really what it
specific-
is.
Yeah.
If you're writing about what they're looking at themselves or something, you're not getting to kind of the meat of the matter. You're not doing enough to really hook the reader, probably.
Yeah.
You might
it's all
even
about what
be
they want.
filtering.
You are probably filtering.
dare you.
I'll take that bet.
The other one I wanted to talk about, which I'm also guilty of. I'm guilty of all of these.
You're
we're
just guilty.
clear.
all
Let's just be
guilty.
clear.
And
Yeah.
about 30 other ones that we're not discussing today
No one is innocent. No one gets out alive.
No one gets out alive here.
are dream sequences. That's.
Just
I
don't.
think you can guess by everyone's reaction to that, how we all feel about dream sequences.
I literally had a writing professor tell me, "Don't ever do a dream sequence."
It's pretty good advice.
Yeah,
It's good advice.
I've read good dream sequences, but you don't want to use a dream sequence to give the reader a piece of information
no.
that you get that is so lazy and so lame.
Yeah.
Like-
and it doesn't happen. No
And it
one's ever
doesn't
had a
happen.
dream where they learn something about the
Ever.
story.
Exactly. No.
Like
It's
ever.
a total literary.
It's the
fallacy
opposite
like-
of what happens. We all
Yeah.
wake up more confused.
Now, to play devil's advocate,
Damn you.
Robert Jordan did create a whole dream sequence, dream world thing for Wheel of Time. And for me, that's the exception that proves the rule, because it was tied into the story very well, and it's a thing. But he can do that. The rest of us should not write dream sequences.
Yeah, I would say let's if you're writing a dream sequence, you may want to think about what you're doing. What is that?
Yeah,
what purpose,
why?
What purpose does it serve exactly?
if they're magical, didn't Bran have magical hallucinations and
Yeah.
dreams in Game of Thrones in which he actually
So,
got
In Game of
information?
Thrones, what he always does is the dreams have these like vague prophecies in them.
Yeah.
You know, like Daenerys will have a dream where she sees like a fiery thing, and she'll see like a dragon egg, and then she'll see like a city, and then like, you know, 2 books later she ends up doing all that
and
shit.
they're short, relatively short.
I don't know
would
if
say.
that's
So they
better.
serve a true purpose.
Yeah,
But
so
still, like, I take a hard line against it early. Like, as a reader, if I start reading something and realize it's a dream sequence, I'm just like,
It bothers me too.
it's annoying. And it's like, if you don't know it's a dream sequence and then they wake up by like surprise it was a dream, that just like pisses me off. It's like,
I mean, there are no rules that any rule can be broken.
right.
But you gotta have a really good goddamn reason to put a dream sequence
yeah,
in your
or
book.
be a multi-million-dollar author.
Well, that's fine. That's fine.
See, luckily for Chris, robots don't have dreams.
Yet.
Well,
I think somebody
do
wrote,
they?
I think somebody wrote
You
a
haven't
book about
finished
that
the
one.
books.
Do androids dream shitty, boring prose passages?
It only matters if they write them down. So we've done writing ticks. So you've heard the big ones: showing versus telling, active versus passive. We've talked about filtering. We've talked about multiple epitaphs, pronouns, character cliches. These are all huge things. The male gaze, the dream sequences, description blocks, rhythm, and sentence structure. These, I should stress, these are only a few. Like we could do a 14-hour long episode.
I assume we're gonna do one of these at least every season.
Yeah.
I think
we
we're gonna, yeah, exactly, and they're each gonna be 14 hours.
Annual gripe session for sure.
But I think the takeaway on this is there are some big things. Again, these are the things that we have seen specifically in our writing group that come out all the time in fantasy and sci-fi, and it's just, I think Chris or Lucy, you said that. When you do the first draft, just get it on the page. This is the stuff you do in editing. This is not the stuff that you want to have in your head when you're putting the words on the page. But as you go back, and if you're reading it out loud, you want to listen for this stuff. And when people give you these notes or you read these things, when you read as a reader, read as a writer, these are the things that you notice.
I think it's also important to keep in mind with like gripes and pet peeves and stuff that like, especially for like newer writers like me, it's not something you want to like beat yourself up about too much. Like
No.
mistakes
Oh,
that
yeah.
absolutely
Yeah.
everybody makes, and that like
You would be a genius if you started and you didn't make any
Didn't
of
do
these
this stuff.
mistakes.
Yeah,
It's
of
just
course.
when you're doing your polish, they're great things to be thinking about
Yeah.
constantly.
And it's a craft. This is how you get better, is by recognizing that there are specific things to do and not to do. And as you do and not do them, you get better.
right.
We're
Over
grinding
like
out the skill points.
30 or 40 years it takes.
Exactly.
So
Give or
hang
take.
in there. That's what I hear.
Don't jump.
That's good.
So on that delightfully negative note, I think that's the end of our first podcast season.
Well, all right.
End of the season.
Everyone, that was amazing.
We
Wow.
made it. No one hurt each other.
I feel like a better writer.
So before we sign off, Lucy has some news to share with us.
Oh yeah. So it's a semi victory. It's
No, come on, don't undercut it.
She's being very modest.
there's a writing competition called Writers of the Future that's sci-fi fantasy focused. If you're writing genre fiction, it's a really good thing to send your short stories to if you're not published yet. And I was a semi-finalist this quarter round. So
Yeah.
it's a step on a ladder.
It's huge.
It's a really awesome thing.
Thanks,
Yeah.
guys.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
You're getting a certificate, right?
I'm getting a certificate.
She's gonna
Name
have
it, put it on your wall.
And it's all possible because of this podcast.
Exactly.
Right. You follow all of
That's
our
right.
instructions.
Well, congratulations, Lucy.
Yeah,
Thank you.
congratulations. That's huge.
Really fucking awesome.
Thank you.
And
Good
for
step
everyone else
forward.
listening, you too can be like Lucy,
Can be
be
semi-victorious.
semi-victorious.
All right. This has been the Genre Hustle. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.